The image lasts only 3 seconds. A stretcher moving slowly through two lines of soldiers standing at attention in the flat morning light of a military base in western Iraq. Not one of them is looking at their commanding officer. Not one of them is waiting for a signal. They are all looking at the same thing, a young woman lying on that stretcher, her face pale against the white of the medical sheet, her eyes half open, her hands resting at her sides like she has finally stopped reaching for something. And then, without a word spoken, without a single order given, one soldier raises his hand to his forehead, then another, until 500 right hands are raised at the same angle, held at the same height, pointed toward the same person. The helicopter pilot, a man who had spent 22 years flying wounded soldiers out of places most people could not find on a map, later said he had never seen anything like it. He said the whole base seemed to exhale at once. He said it felt like watching the ocean go still. Nobody gave the order. That is the part that stays with you. Now go back. Go back 9 months before that morning, before the stretcher and the silence, and the 500 raised hands. Go back to a farmhouse in rural Ohio where a little girl is sitting at a kitchen table, watching an old man do something she has watched him do every morning of her life. Emma Calloway was 8 years old the first time she understood that her grandfather was different from other men. It was not the medals that told her this. It was the way he handled them. The way Arlo Calloway, 70 years old and built like a man who had spent his life doing difficult things in difficult weather, would sit down at that kitchen table every morning with a small cloth and a bottle of metal polish and go to work on those three decorations as if they were the most important objects in the world. He never rushed. He never skipped a morning. He turned each metal over in his thick fingers with the focused attention a surgeon gives a scalpel, working the cloth into the edges and the raised lettering with a patience that seemed to a child watching almost religious. Emma watched from across the table, her cereal going soft in the bowl in front of her, and she waited for the stories. They always came. Arlo Calloway had a voice that was made for telling stories, low and unhurried with the slight flatness of a man who grew up in the middle of the country, far from anything dramatic. He talked about night operations in dense terrain, about the weight of a pack when your boots are soaked through and you have been moving for 16 hours without stopping, about the moment you look at the man beside you and realize that neither of you is going to make it back by nightfall, and somehow that becomes something you can both live with because the mission requires it. He talked about a medic named Porter who once kept 3 men alive using nothing but what he could find in the mud around him. He talked about what it meant to run toward the sound of something when every nerve in your body was screaming at you to run the other direction. He talked about what courage felt like from the inside. Not loud, not heroic in any cinematic way. Just a quiet decision made in a very short amount of time with no guarantee about what came after. Emma absorbed all of it. By the time she was 12, she had memorized the shape of each medal. By the time she was 15, she knew the names of every man Arlo had mentioned. By the time she was 17, she had begun to understand in a wordless way she could not have explained to anyone that her life was going to move in a particular direction. Not because she had been told it should, because when she imagined herself standing in the places her grandfather described, the feeling that came was not fear. It was recognition. She was not the biggest girl in her school. She was not the loudest or the most decorated. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, 118 pounds, with brown eyes that held on to things longer than was comfortable for the people around her. Her teachers noted that she was unusually calm under pressure. Her classmates noticed that when someone got hurt, she was always the first one there and she never looked scared. She looked like she had already decided what to do next. When Emma Calloway was 20 years old in the spring of 2003, she walked into a Marine Corps recruitment office in Columbus and told the recruiter behind the desk that she wanted to become a combat medic. The recruiter, a staff sergeant named Pulliam, who had seen hundreds of young people come through that door, looked at her for a long moment. He asked if she understood what she was signing up for. She said yes. He asked if she had anyone at home she needed to talk to first. She said her grandfather would understand. Pulliam studied her face another moment, noted the stillness in it, and pulled out the paperwork. 3 weeks before she was scheduled to leave for Paris Island, Emma went looking for a box. It was not something she had planned to do. She was in the attic of her grandfather's house, pulling down her old duffel bag from a shelf when she saw it. A green metal box with a small combination lock tucked behind a row of old tax documents, dusty in a way that suggested it had not been moved in years. The lock was set to 0000 because Arlo Calloway had never been a man who worried about other people going through his things. Emma had always respected his privacy. She respected it still. But the box was already open, the lock hanging loose through the clasp, and something she still cannot fully explain made her reach for it. Inside were official documents, military service records, dates and unit designations and transaction codes she did not fully understand at first glance. But she understood enough. She had grown up in a house that treated those three metals like sacred objects. She had spent her entire childhood absorbing stories about night operations and impossible terrain and a medic named Porter. She knew what combat service records looked like from the books she had read, and what she was holding in her hands did not look like that. Arlo Calloway had served for 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. He had done his job without complaint and received an honorable discharge. The commendations he had earned were real. The years of service were real. But the unit he had served with was a logistics and supply battalion stationed out of Camp Lejeune. He had managed the distribution of equipment and rations to forward units. He had never been deployed to a combat zone. He had never run toward anything under fire. He had never stood in the mud in the dark and made a decision that determined whether anyone lived or died. Emma stood in the attic for a long time with those papers in her hands. She did not cry. She was not by nature a person who cried easily. She stood there in the particular silence that comes when something you have built your understanding of the world around turns out to have been constructed from different materials than you thought. She looked at the metals through the attic window where they sat in their small wooden case on the shelf below, and she tried to locate the feeling moving through her. It took her a while to find it. It was not betrayal, not even disappointment exactly. Something more like recognition. The recognition that her grandfather had looked at her when she was small and uncertain and had given her the thing he thought she needed most. He had given her a story, not his story. A story he had built out of other men's courage, shaped and polished and handed to her with the same care he gave those metals every morning. The method was wrong. The love behind it was entirely real. She put the papers back in the box. She closed the lock. She carried her duffel bag down the stairs. That evening, sitting on the porch with Arlo as the Ohio light went flat and golden over the fields, Emma made a decision she would not be able to fully articulate for many years. She decided she was done living inside someone else's story. She was going to go out and build one of her own, a real one, made of real decisions in real places where the stakes were not invented and the outcomes were not predetermined. She was going to make the kind of story that did not need a combination lock to protect it. She never told her grandfather what she had found. She never told anyone. Paris Island in the summer of 2003 was exactly what everyone said it would be, and also somehow worse. The heat was a physical presence pushing against you from all sides from the moment you stepped off the bus. The drill instructors were neither cruel nor kind in any way that resembled civilian definitions of those words. They were relentless. They operated on the premise that the fastest way to build something reliable was to first find out what it was made of, and the fastest way to find that out was to apply maximum pressure and observe what happened. What happened with Emma Calloway was that she got quieter. Most recruits responded to sustained pressure by getting louder or by collapsing inward. Emma got quieter. She ran the obstacle courses with her jaw set and her breathing controlled. She studied medical protocols at night with a flashlight while other recruits slept. She did not complain about the heat or the food or the hours. Her instructors noticed her the way good instructors notice things that are unusual. She was not the fastest or the strongest. She was not the one who impressed you in any obvious way. She was the one you suddenly realized you had been watching for 10 minutes without being sure exactly when you started. She had a way of being calm that was not passive. It was a loaded calm, the kind that has something specific behind it. During a particularly brutal march in the 6th week of training, a recruit named Ostrowski went down with heat exhaustion 2 miles from the finish point. Emma was 30 meters behind him when it happened. She was there before anyone else had fully processed what had occurred. She checked his pulse and skin temperature and breathing, and then performed the correct sequence of interventions in the correct order without anyone directing her. Her instructor, watching from 4 feet away, said nothing until it was over. Then he said one word: "Good." That was a significant word on Paris Island. Emma graduated in the top 4% of her class. Arlo Calloway flew out from Ohio for the ceremony. He sat in the folding chairs in his good shirt with his hands on his knees and watched his granddaughter receive the Eagle Globe and Anchor. There is a photograph from that day. Emma in her dress uniform, her grandfather beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at her with an expression that suggests he is trying to memorize the exact details of the moment before the moment ends. What he could not have known was that Emma's path to standing in that photograph had not been entirely straight. The examining physician's name was Dr. Garland Price. He was thorough in the way military doctors are thorough efficiently and without ceremony. He had Emma on the table for 40 minutes and covered all standard areas and then spent an extra 2 minutes on something that made him reach for his stethoscope a second time. He listened. He made a note. He told Emma to sit up. The murmur was slight. The murmur was a mild anomaly in the mitral valve, the kind of thing that might never cause a problem in ordinary life, the kind that might go completely undetected in a person not planning to spend extended time in extreme physical and psychological conditions. For civilian life, unremarkable. For the demands of frontline combat deployment, not acceptable under regulations. He told her she would need a specialist referral and that her status would be reviewed pending that outcome. He said it in the flat professional tone of a man who had delivered this kind of news before and had learned not to attach too much of himself to the conversation. Emma thanked him. She got dressed. She walked back to the barracks. That night, she lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. She thought about the green metal box in her grandfather's attic. She thought about a medic named Porter, who may never have existed. She thought about a girl who had walked into a recruitment office in Columbus and told a staff sergeant that her grandfather would understand. She thought about what it meant to be this close to the thing she had been building toward her entire adult life and have it interrupted by something she had never asked for and could not have prevented. In the morning, she requested permission to be examined at a different facility. She said she had been uncomfortable with the procedure and wanted a fresh evaluation. It was not an outrageous request. These things happened. She received the appointment. At the second facility, she did not mention the first examination. She listed her medical history as clean. The examining physician found nothing significant. She was cleared. It was not a complicated deception. It was also not a small one. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it with the same controlled focus she brought to everything else. And she carried the knowledge of it forward, the way you carry something that has no good place to be put down. She had made a choice. The only way to honor it was to make sure every single thing she did from that point forward was worth what it had cost. She had never been more serious about anything in her life. In March of 2005, Corporal Emma Calloway, 22 years old, boarded a military transport aircraft at Cherry Point Air Station in North Carolina. The aircraft carried 41 Marines to a staging base in Kuwait and from there to a forward operating base in Iraq's Anbar province, a stretch of desert and fractured towns, an empty highway that had developed over the previous 2 years a particular reputation for being among the most dangerous assignments for American military personnel. The base housed approximately 500 Marines at any given time. It sat on the western edge of a provincial town whose name Emma had practiced saying until it came naturally. The base was a collection of reinforced structures, generator noise, and the organized tension that develops in places where people are maintaining operational readiness while managing the knowledge that on any given morning, the situation can change completely and permanently. Captain Marcus Webb commanded the base with the authority of a man who had earned it through methods that were difficult to fake. He was 41 years old, built with the economy of someone who had never had the luxury of carrying anything extra, and he had a quality of attention that the people under his command described in different ways. The generous one said he noticed everything. The other said he never missed anything. The difference between those two descriptions was significant, and which one applied tended to depend on whether you had given him reason to pay close attention to you specifically. Emma had been on the base for 11 days when he first paid that kind of attention to her. A convoy returning from a route clearance operation came back -2 men. Not dead, pinned down at a secondary position 3 kilometers north after an IED had taken out the lead vehicle and scattered the patrol. Webb organized the response in 4 minutes. Emma was in the medical bay when the radio came through, and she was at the vehicle by the time it was loaded. The 2 injured Marines had compression injuries from the blast. One had shrapnel in his left thigh that had missed the femoral artery by a margin the surgeons would later call fortunate. Emma assessed both men in under 90 seconds, made the call on tourniquet placement with the confidence of someone who had run this scenario enough times that the decision came before the deliberation, and kept both men stable through the 20-minute drive to the base medical unit. Webb watched all of it from 6 feet away. When it was over and both men were being taken inside, he looked at Emma the way he looked at things he was filing away for future reference. He said nothing to her directly. He did not need to. The base ran on observation in the kind of respect that does not require expression. Emma had entered the category of people who had demonstrated something real. That was enough. What Webb could not see was that Emma's hands had been trembling slightly during those first 90 seconds. Not from fear alone. from the effort of managing a body that had already in those early weeks begun operating slightly outside the range it was designed for. She had taken her medication at 500. She had slept 4 hours. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She had noticed all of this and set it aside and done the work. That was the arrangement she had made with herself. She would ask her body to do extraordinary things, and it would do them, and she would manage the gap through discipline and pharmaceuticals, and the refusal to look too carefully at the arithmetic. So far, the arrangement was holding. She intended to keep it that way. The person who would most complicate that arrangement, though he did not know it, was Corporal Reese Briggs. Reese Briggs was 24 years old from Clarkston, Michigan, and he was the kind of person who made you feel that the room had slightly more air in it than before he walked in. Not physically large, not particularly loud, but possessed of a quality of engaged interest in the world around him that was unusual in a combat zone where most people learn to manage the width of their attention carefully. Reese had either not learned this or had decided against it. He paid attention to everything and everyone with an openness that seemed in context almost reckless. He had been assigned to the same medical unit as Emma. He had a habit of talking through procedures while he worked, not because he needed to narrate, but because silence made him uncomfortable in a way that activity did not. He asked Emma questions, not intrusive ones, not the kind requiring personal disclosure, but curious ones that demonstrated genuine interest in how she thought, why she chose one technique over another, what her reasoning was for a particular sequencing decision. He treated her answers as if they had value worth receiving. Emma, who had spent her training learning to be invisible in the ways that mattered, found this slightly disorienting. She also found, against her better judgment, that she was beginning to rely on it. They developed a rhythm in the first weeks that suited both of them. Reese covered the volume and Emma covered the precision. He managed patients who needed reassurance and distraction. She managed the ones who needed someone to make the right call very quickly. They stayed up late on the same watch rotation and talked about things that had nothing to do with where they were, his mother's cooking, Emma's grandfather's morning ritual with the metals, the way Ohio looked in October, when the light changed and the fields went the color of old copper. Small things, the kind of small things that act as ballast when the larger things are too heavy to carry directly. Reese had no idea what Emma was carrying. Emma intended to keep it that way. In the last week of May, as the heat settled into a permanent and unforgiving temperature that made the days feel like something to push through rather than move through, Emma received a letter from Ohio. Arlo wrote to her every 2 weeks. His letters were short and precise, the same way he talked, the same way he did most things. He described the weather. He described the fields. He described the neighbors and their business with affectionate detachment. At the end of every letter, in the same spot, in his large, deliberate handwriting, he wrote the same 3 words: bring yourself back, not bring yourself home. Bring yourself back. Emma read the letter twice sitting on the edge of her bunk in the early morning before the base was fully awake. She folded it along its original creases and put it in the small metal box she kept under the bed with the others. Then she got up and began the day. She did not write back about the medication she took each morning. She did not write about the specific calculations she made before each mission. She wrote about the food and the weather and the strange beauty of the desert in early morning, when the light was low and the distances looked impossible. She wrote, I am exactly where I decided to be. She meant it entirely. There is a kind of reputation that builds not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of many small ones. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with ceremony. It grows the way certain things grow in difficult environments, slowly and without obvious nourishment, taking hold in the cracks between the larger events, until one day someone looks at the ground and realizes something substantial has taken root there without anyone planning it. By the end of her second month at the base in Anbar, Emma Calloway had that kind of reputation. Not because of one dramatic thing she had done, because of the pattern of how she did everything. The way she moved through a casualty scenario with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had already run ahead in her mind and identified every decision point before her hands got involved. The way she talked to patients, not loudly and not with false brightness, but with a directness that had something settling in it, something that told the person in front of her that they were being seen clearly and that the person seeing them clearly was not alarmed. The way she prepared her kit at the start of every shift with the same sequence and same attention, whether or not there was any reason to expect the shift would require it. Webb watched all of it. He was building a mental inventory of the people he could place in the worst situations and trust to make the right decisions. The inventory was not long, it never is. But by the end of June, he had moved Emma's name toward the front of it, And when the intelligence report came through on a Tuesday morning, at the end of that month, hers was one of the first names he said out loud. The report described a cluster of buildings on the western edge of a village 11 kilometers from the base, a family compound caught in the space between two armed factions moving through the area. The compound's residents, most of them civilians, several of them children, had not been able to get out before the situation deteriorated. At least 4 seriously wounded. A narrow window in which an extraction could be attempted before the situation closed entirely. Webb assembled the team in 12 minutes. He described the objective in the flat informational tone that experienced commanders use when they want the people listening to stay inside their training rather than their emotions. Get in, locate the wounded, stabilize for transport, get out. The window was not generous. The margin for extended operations was close to zero. Emma listened with her hands clasped in front of her eyes on the map. She asked 2 questions. Both were specific and practical, and Webb answered them in the same register she had used. He noted that she did not ask about contingencies. He noted that she did not ask what happened if the window closed before they were finished. He would think about both of those things later. The helicopter flight out took 19 minutes. Emma spent the first 10 reviewing protocols in her head and the last 9 watching the terrain below shift from open ground to the compressed geometry of a built environment. Reese Briggs sat across from her, with his medical bag between his boots and his jaw set and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was running scenarios. He looked at her once briefly. She looked back. That was enough. The compound was worse than the briefing had suggested. Part of the main structure had taken damage in the previous 24 hours. One wall had come down and part of the roof with it creating a collapse zone that had trapped 2 of the residents and injured 3 others who had been nearby. The smell of the place hit Emma before she was fully inside dust and blood and the chemical sharpness of recent structural damage. She registered it and moved past it. 6 wounded in total. An elderly man who had been closest to the collapse and presented with the internal signs of someone whose body had absorbed a significant concussive force. 2 women in their 30s with fracture injuries and lacerations. A boy of approximately 11 with a compound fracture of the left forearm. A teenage girl with a deep wound along her right side. An older woman who was mobile but disoriented in a way that indicated head injury. Emma assessed all 6 in under 4 minutes. She made her triage ranking and began moving through it. Reese took the 2nd and 3rd priority cases. The other team members prepared for extraction. Someone outside was managing communication with the helicopter. Beyond the building, sounds that were not theirs were getting closer in a way everyone could hear, and no one was commenting on directly. The team leader's voice came through the radio at the 18-minute mark. 5 minutes to the extraction window. The helicopter could not carry the full ground team and all 6 casualties in a single lift. Most critical patients would go first. A second lift was possible, but the window on the second was not guaranteed. Emma looked at the elderly man. She looked at the boy. She looked at the 3 remaining wounded who were stable enough to wait, but not stable enough to move without medical management. She made the calculation the way she made all her calculations. Without drama, without extended deliberation inside the compressed time frame the situation provided. She told Reese to take the elderly man and the boy to the extraction point. She told the other team members to take the 2 most serious of the remaining cases. She said she would stay with the last 3 and bring them out on the second lift. Reese stopped moving. He turned and looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once. He said her name. She said his. He started to say something and she cut him off, not unkindly but completely, and told him she needed him to take those 2 patients to that helicopter right now because the elderly man who had been declining for the past 8 minutes would not make it to a surgical unit in time if they delayed. Reese looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up the elderly man's stretcher. He looked back at her once from the doorway. She was already crouched beside the first of the remaining patients, her hands moving. Then he was gone and she was alone with the 3 wounded and the sounds outside getting closer and the light inside the compound going flat and difficult. The next 22 minutes were the longest of Emma Calloway's life. Not because of the sounds outside, which continued to advance in a way that required constant adjustment to her timeline and her pace. Not because of the failing light, the generator having died at some point, leaving her working by the flashlight clamped to her shoulder. Not because the teenage girl had gone into a fear response that required managing with one part of her attention while the other part stayed on the clinical work, because of what her body was doing. She had taken her medication at 0500. It was now past 1600. The physical effort of the past hour had put her cardiovascular system into a register outside the range her condition handled well. She could feel it. Not pain exactly. More like the sound an engine makes when it has been running past its service interval and has decided to stop being polite about it. Her vision stayed clear. Her hands stayed precise. But maintaining that precision now required something extra from her that it had not required 3 months ago, and the difference between those two states was not small. She applied the pressure bandage on the teenage girl's wound with the correct pressure and the correct angle, and she talked to her through all of it, not words that required translation, just the tone of them, the steady, unbothered quality of a voice that tells you through its texture alone that the person it belongs to has not decided to panic, and therefore you do not have to either. The radio crackled at the 20-minute mark. Second lift confirmed. 3 minutes. Emma got the three patients to their feet. The older woman with the head injury was the most difficult. Mobile but needing guidance, and Emma could not carry her and manage the other two simultaneously. She moved them in stages one short distance at a time, managing the older woman's direction with her left hand and keeping her right hand free. When they came out of the compound into the open ground between the buildings and the extraction point, Emma could see the helicopter. She could see the crew. She could see Reese Briggs 20 meters away, with his arms moving, signaling her forward, his face doing something she had not seen it do before. Later he would tell her she looked like someone carrying a building, that she looked like she was doing something the laws of physics had not specifically authorized, but had also failed to explicitly prohibit. He would say this quietly without his usual humor, and she would understand from the absence of the humor exactly how much he had meant it. They got all three patients to the helicopter. The second lift cleared the extraction zone with 4 minutes to spare before the window closed completely. The commendation came 2 weeks later. Webb submitted the paperwork himself and added a personal note describing Emma's decision to remain behind as demonstrating judgment and commitment consistent with the highest standards of the medical corps. The other team members added their accounts. Together they made a picture of those 22 minutes that was accurate in its facts, if not entirely adequate to the texture of what had actually happened inside that compound. Emma received the news sitting on the edge of her bunk at 06:30 after a night shift. She read the document twice, folded it, and put it with her grandfather's letters. Then she went back to work. This was the part those who observed her from a distance could not fully account for. Most people following an experience of that intensity require something from the period afterward. They require acknowledgement or rest, or the permission to be temporarily less than they normally are. Emma seemed to require none of these things. She returned to her normal schedule and quietly expanded it. Where she had been working 14-hour days, she was now working 17. Where she had eaten base meals with whatever regularity the schedule allowed, she was now skipping them with enough frequency that Reese noticed and mentioned it once carefully. She told him she was managing her nutrition and changed the subject. She was sleeping 3 hours a night, sometimes less. The medication she had brought with her, the prescription she filled every 2 months through a cardiologist in Columbus, who knew her only as a civilian patient, was running lower than it should have been at this point in the deployment. She had been increasing the dosage incrementally, managing the growing distance between what her body could sustain naturally and what she was demanding of it. Always carefully, always just enough. She had been telling herself for weeks that she would pull back, moderate the pace, sleep a full night, give the machinery of her chest the conditions it needed to function without supplementation. She told herself this every night before she fell asleep and every morning when she woke up. Then the shift would begin, and there would be something that needed to be done, and she would do it, and the moderating would be postponed to tomorrow. There was always something that needed to be done. It was a Sunday morning in late August when Reese Briggs found the medication. Emma was on a 30-minute meal break, which meant she had gone to the mess hall, eaten approximately half of what was on her tray, and returned to the medical bay to check on two patients before the break was technically over. She had left her personal kit on the table near the supply cabinet. The kit was partially open. Reese was restocking when he looked over and saw the orange prescription bottle sitting at the top of the open kit, the label facing up at an angle that gave him enough of the print to read the name of the medication and the prescribing physician. He stood there for a moment. He was not a cardiologist, but he was a Marine Corps combat medic who had completed the same training Emma had and paid attention during all of it. He knew what that medication was prescribed for. He knew what diagnosis typically produced that prescription. He looked at the bottle for a long time, doing the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers. He thought about the past 5 months. He thought about Emma's hours, about the meals she did not eat and the sleep she did not get, and the way her hands had been subtly different in the past few weeks. Not less precise, never less precise, but requiring something extra from her to maintain that precision. He had noticed this the way you notice a change in someone you watch closely without immediately finding a frame for it. Now he had the frame. He put the bottle back exactly where he had found it. He went to his own kit and pulled out the small green notebook he used for patient notes and began a new section at the back separated from the clinical entries by 6 blank pages. He wrote the date at the top. He wrote down everything he had observed over the previous 5 months that was now legible in this new light. The meals, the sleep, the subtle variations in her presentation at the beginning and end of long shifts. He did it in the careful, specific language of a medical professional, making a record because that was the only language he trusted himself with right now. He did not report it. He made a choice that he would spend years afterward examining from different angles, testing against different standards of loyalty and duty and friendship. He chose silence because Emma was still the best medic on the base and no patient had been harmed by her condition, and reporting her meant removing her, and removing her meant the people who depended on her most would no longer have her. He chose it because she had trusted him in the way people trust those they work beside in difficult places, implicitly and without declaration, and breaking that trust felt like a violence he was not willing to commit. He chose it because he could not look at what she was doing and call it anything other than what it was: the most sustained and deliberate act of devotion to other people's survival he had ever witnessed in his life. So he kept the notebook. He updated it every day. He watched her. He made sure that if anything changed, if the gap between what she was asking of herself and what she could give began to close in a way that threatened the quality of her work or her own safety, he would act. He would have the information to act correctly. Emma never noticed the notebook. She was too busy watching everyone else. There was one other person on the base watching Emma Calloway in those months, though, in a different way and for different reasons entirely. Private Cole Rafferty had arrived in mid-July on a transport from Kuwait with 11 other Marines, all of them new enough that their gear still looked like it belonged to someone else. He was 19 years old and from a small town in western Pennsylvania, the youngest person currently stationed at the base by a margin everyone around him seemed aware of. He was not lacking in capability. He was lacking the particular settled weight that experience puts on a person, the quality that comes from having been through enough difficult things that the next difficult thing does not feel entirely unprecedented. On his first night at the base, he had sat in the corner of the barracks with his face turned toward the wall. He had not made any sound. He had not needed to. Emma had been ending a late shift when she passed the barracks doorway, and she had seen the particular quality of someone's stillness that is not rest. She had gone in. She had sat down near him without explaining herself or asking anything that required an answer. She had stayed for 2 hours in the easy quiet of someone who has decided that being present is the entire requirement. And at the end, she had said one thing. She had said, it gets more manageable, not easier. More manageable. She had gone back to her bunk and slept 3 hours and started the next day. Rafferty never forgot it. He carried those words the way people carry things that arrive at exactly the moment when the architecture of their resolve needs one more piece to hold. He watched Emma the way young soldiers watch the people who have shown them something true. He did not speak of it to anyone. He filed it away in a place he did not often visit because visiting it made him feel things he was not yet practiced at managing. He would not speak of it until the morning it became the most important thing he had ever done. September arrived and the temperature finally began to do something other than insist on itself. The base entered a period of high operational tempo that pushed every unit past its normal capacity. Emma worked 20 days straight without a full 8-hour rest period. She told herself the pace was temporary. She told herself it would ease after the current phase. She told herself she was managing what? Her body had its own account of what was happening, and the entries were beginning to tell a different story. The dizziness started as something small. Brief vertigo when she stood too quickly, the kind attributable to dehydration or low blood pressure or accumulated sleep deficit. She attributed it to all three and treated it by drinking more water and eating more carefully and noting that she needed to sleep more soon. She did not sleep more. The tempo did not ease. The dizziness became another variable she managed around another thing she was tracking and compensating for, along with everything else. October brought a stretch that Emma would later describe in the careful understatement she used for all self-assessments as demanding. What it actually was 11 separate casualty events in 14 days, often with minimal time between them, often at hours that required her to move from deep exhaustion directly into high-function clinical work with no transition. She did all of it. She did all of it well. She kept two Marines alive who would not have survived without the decisions she made in the sequence she made them. She did not lose a patient. She was also running her body the way you run something when the warning lights have been on for weeks and you have learned to stop looking at the dashboard. Reese updated his notebook every night. He tracked her meal intake from a distance and noted dates and approximate quantities in clinical shorthand. He noted she was now visibly thinner than she had been in March. He noted that the change in her presentation at the end of long shifts was now sometimes also present at the beginning. He considered reporting all of it to Dr. Patricia Holt 4 separate times. 4 separate times he did not do it. He left a meal on her bunk twice with no note. She ate it both times. Neither of them said anything about it. That was enough. It had to be enough. The training exercise happened on a Wednesday morning in November. A piece of equipment had malfunctioned during a standard drill. 2 Marines were down. The call came through at 0840, and Emma was there in 6 minutes with her kit moving the way she always moved toward emergencies without hesitation and without anything on her face that suggested she found the situation other than manageable. The first Marine had a deep laceration on his right thigh. Significant bleeding, not arterial, but requiring immediate pressure and assessment. Emma went to him first, her hands finding the correct position before she had consciously decided on it, the triage sequence running in her body, while the analytical part of her mind organized the parallel response. The second Marine was on the ground 8 feet away, a blow to the head from the falling equipment, conscious but with the responses that were wrong in the ways that signal something more serious than the surface injury. Emma kept part of her attention on his presentation while her hands managed the first patient's wound. She worked for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, two things were happening simultaneously. The work was proceeding correctly, and inside her chest, the system that had been running past its tolerance for 8 months was beginning to do what overtaxed systems eventually do. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with pain or sudden failure. It came as a gradual shift in the quality of what was available to her, like a light source losing voltage. The illumination still present, but no longer full. The dizziness came at the 11-minute mark. Not the small, manageable vertigo she had learned to work around. Something larger, accompanied by a low register presence at the edges of her hearing that was not external. She gripped the first Marine's arm to steady herself. She registered that her vision had changed in a way that required conscious management rather than natural function. She told herself to keep going. She kept going. The second Marine's pupils were showing the asymmetry that indicated increased intracranial pressure. She needed to get to him. She stood and the world went sideways, and she took 2 steps and stopped and waited for it to pass. It passed enough. She got to him and knelt and began the examination and talked to him in the steady tone that said everything was being managed and that whatever was wrong, he was in capable hands. She heard Reese's voice from somewhere behind her. She knew from the quality of it that he had seen something. She did not turn around. She finished the examination. She called the assessment over her shoulder. Her words came out wrong. She could hear that they came out wrong. She tried again. The second attempt was better, but not right. She was aware that the people around her were paying attention to something that was not the patient's. The helicopter came in low over the base perimeter and settled into the landing zone with the downwash moving everything not attached to something fixed. Emma stood up to signal the crew, and the standing was the last thing her body agreed to do on her behalf that morning. She felt the ground coming up before she understood she was falling. She had one thought before the light went away entirely. Not about herself, about the second Marine, about whether the evacuation team had the correct assessment of his intracranial pressure, about whether she had communicated the pupil asymmetry clearly enough to someone who would act on it in time. She was still thinking about his pupils when everything stopped. Reese Briggs was at her side before she fully reached the ground. He had been watching her for the past 4 minutes with the attention of someone who has been keeping a careful record and has just watched that record change its character entirely. He caught her shoulder before she went all the way down and lowered her with his hands under her head, and then he was on the radio and his voice had none of its usual quality, none of the warmth or the humor. Just the flat, urgent language of a trained professional reporting a medical emergency in the vocabulary he had been given for exactly this. Her pulse was there. It was not what it should have been. He checked her airway and breathing and looked at the color of her skin and cataloged all of it in the same part of his mind that had been keeping the notebook, the part that had been watching and measuring for months. He had known on some level that this was inside the range of possible outcomes. He had stayed awake on certain nights with that knowledge pressing against the inside of his chest. The knowing had not made arriving here any easier. The base emergency team reached them in 4 minutes. Dr. Patricia Holt was with them. She knelt beside Emma and made the rapid assessment of a physician who has been doing this long enough that the assessment runs faster than the observations that produce it. She called for transport. She looked up at Reese. He was already holding the green notebook out toward her. His hand was steady. His face was not. Dr. Holt took the notebook. She looked at it for 10 seconds. She looked at Reese. She looked back at the notebook. She looked at Emma, still and pale on the ground, with the November air moving over the base in thin, dry currents. She thought about the small inconsistency she had noted weeks ago in Emma's intake documentation. Something minor enough to defer. Something that had never entirely left the back of her mind. She looked at the notebook and she looked at Emma's face and she thought about all of it at once, the way physicians learn to think about complex presentations, all the variables simultaneously looking for the pattern that connects them. She had found the pattern. Emma was loaded onto a stretcher and carried to the base hospital, and the November light was flat and pale over the compound, and behind them in the landing zone, the helicopter crew had successfully loaded both injured Marines, both of whom were going to be fine. Reese walked beside Emma's stretcher the entire way. He did not speak. He kept his hand near her arm without touching it, the way you hold yourself close to something you cannot protect and cannot bring yourself to leave. Dr. Holt walked on the other side with the notebook in her hand and the expression of someone who has understood something important and is now calculating what that understanding is going to require of her. What it was going to require was a decision that had no version, where everyone came out undamaged. Behind the door of the base hospital, Emma Calloway's body was finally given permission to stop. Outside, 500 Marines went about the business of a deployment that was still ongoing and still needed what it needed. The generators ran, the radios crackled. The afternoon shift began its rotation. Not one of them knew yet what was coming, but some things have already been decided before they happen. The 500 raised hands were already there waiting in the future, waiting for the morning that would call them into being. There is a particular quality of silence inside military hospitals at night. It is not the silence of absence. The base outside continues its operations regardless of the hour, the generators keeping their low constant note, the radios exchanging information in the clipped, efficient language of people who have learned to say the important things quickly. The silence inside the hospital is something layered on top of all that activity existing in deliberate counterpoint to it. A silence that has been set aside for a purpose. The purpose of returning people to themselves. Emma Calloway lay in the bed closest to the window and listened to that silence for a long time before she fully understood where she was. The understanding came back in pieces, the way understanding comes back after the body has made its position clear and the mind has had to follow. She became aware of the IV line in her left arm before she became aware of the room. She became aware of the room before she became aware of the time. The window showed darkness with a thin line of exterior light along its lower edge. She had been unconscious for 11 hours. Dr. Patricia Holt was sitting in the chair beside the bed when Emma's eyes came fully open. Not doing anything in particular, not reading or writing or looking at anything specific, simply there with the focused stillness of someone who has decided to be in a particular place and has made peace with waiting as long as the waiting requires. She was holding the green notebook in her lap with both hands, not open, just held. Emma looked at the notebook. She looked at Dr. Holt. She said, "How long have you known?" Dr. Holt said long enough to have more questions than answers. Then she asked the first one. The conversation lasted 2 hours. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be. Dr. Holt asked her questions in a direct sequence that moved from the medical history to the falsified intake examination to the management of the condition during deployment, and Emma answered all of them with the same directness, without deflection, and without the kind of performed remorse people sometimes use as a substitute for actual accounting. She said she had known about the valve condition before she enlisted. She said she had obtained a clean examination by going to a different facility and not disclosing the previous finding. She said she had managed the condition throughout her deployment with a prescription maintained through a civilian cardiologist in Columbus. She said she had monitored herself carefully and maintained a consistent standard of patient care. She said she understood that what she had done violated military medical fitness regulations and that she was prepared to accept whatever that meant for her service record. She said all of this clearly and without asking for anything in return. Dr. Holt listened without interrupting. When Emma was finished, the doctor was quiet for a moment and then asked one more question. She asked whether Emma had considered what would have happened to her patients if her condition had produced an incapacitating event during a critical procedure. Emma was quiet for a long moment. She said yes. She said she had considered it. She said she had made the calculation each time and concluded that the risk was within an acceptable range, given the quality of care she was providing against the alternative of that care not being available. She said she knew that was not how regulations framed the calculation. She said she had made it anyway. Dr. Holt looked at her for a long time. Then she said she was going to need to disclose the findings to Captain Webb. She said what happened after that was not entirely within her control. She said a formal review would likely be triggered. She said she thought Emma already knew all of this. Emma said yes. She said she had known it was a possibility from the beginning. She said she had decided the work was worth the risk of the outcome. Dr. Holt closed the notebook. She set it on the bedside table. She stood and looked at Emma with an expression containing a complexity of things professional assessment and something that was not entirely professional. The particular regard one person carries for another after spending 2 hours understanding a life from the inside. She said, "You need to sleep now." She turned off the light and left the room. Emma lay in the dark listening to the hospital silence and the generators underneath it and the thin distant sounds of a base that was still operational. She thought about Reese in his notebook. She thought about the second Marine's pupil asymmetry and whether she had communicated it clearly enough in those last seconds before she fell. She thought about her grandfather's kitchen table and the morning light through the window and the smell of the metal polish and the sound of his voice beginning a story she had heard before and was going to hear again. She fell asleep thinking about that table. The diagnosis Dr. Holt delivered the following morning was thorough and measured and contained no surprises for Emma. The valve condition had progressed under sustained physical and psychological load beyond what the original examining physician would have predicted for a civilian life, not to a critical stage, but to a stage requiring attention rest and a genuine reduction in demand that could not be accomplished within an active combat deployment. The immediate findings were severe dehydration, a cardiovascular system operating significantly below its functional baseline, and the accumulated physical deficit of someone who had been borrowing against reserves she did not have. The treatment plan involved IV hydration, medication adjustment, and monitored rest. The longer-term plan involved transfer to a military medical facility in Germany for comprehensive evaluation by a cardiac specialist. That second part was what Captain Marcus Webb came to discuss. He arrived at 1400 in his full uniform, which was not an accident. Webb did not make choices about appearance carelessly. He sat in the chair Dr. Holt had occupied the previous night and put his hands on his knees and looked at Emma with the expression of a man who has been given a complex situation and has taken sufficient time to decide how he wants to inhabit it. He told her that Dr. Holt had made her disclosure and that he had reviewed the notebook and pulled Emma's full medical and service record. He told her the regulatory situation was what it was and that a formal review would take place. He said this directly and without apologizing for it. Then he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you know what the evacuation transport procedure looks like from my end?" Emma said no, he told her. He told her that evacuation of a medical case required coordination between the medical officer, the command structure, and the transport team. He told her that scheduling was typically managed quietly, that most evacuations were processed with minimal base-wide visibility. He told her that in her case, he had received an unofficial request to allow information about her evacuation to be shared through informal channels. The request had come from Private Cole Rafferty. Emma looked at him. Webb said that Private Rafferty, the youngest Marine currently on the base, had come to his office at 0630 that morning. He had stood at attention in front of the desk and said in words that Webb was going to repeat verbatim, because he found them worth repeating, that Corporal Calloway had sat with him for 2 hours on his first night at the base, and that he had not been all right, and she had known he was not all right without being told, and she had not made him feel ashamed of not being all right, and that he wanted the chance to say goodbye, and that he thought other people might want that too. Webb said he had looked at this 19-year-old Marine standing at attention at 0630, making a formal request on behalf of a woman he had known for 4 months, and he had decided the appropriate response was to grant it. He said he had not expected 500 people. He said he was not sure anyone could have expected that. Emma was doing the thing that was not quite crying the active maintenance of a decision not to cry. Webb stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her one more time with the evaluating quality always present in his attention, and then with something else underneath it, something that did not have a name in the official vocabulary of the United States Marine Corps. He said, "Corporal Calloway, the transport departs at 700. He said, "Get some sleep." He left. The morning of the evacuation came in cold and flat, the light arriving without warmth over the flat ground of the base. The medical transport team arrived at Emma's room at 0630 to begin preparing her for the journey to the airfield. She was conscious and weak, her usual bright focus dulled by exhaustion and medication but present. She was aware of everything happening around her with the careful, diminished attention of someone operating on reduced resources who has decided to use all of them on what matters. When they wheeled her out of the hospital, she understood immediately that something was different. The path from the hospital entrance to the helicopter landing zone was approximately 200 meters across open ground. That ground was not open this morning. On both sides of the path, standing at attention in two long parallel lines that stretched the full distance from the hospital door to the landing zone, were Marines. Not a few, not a token gathering. Every Marine on the base who could obtain permission to leave their duties had come. The lines were dense and continuous, soldiers standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, filling the space with the particular stillness of people who have decided on a thing and are not going to be moved from it. Emma's stretcher moved between those lines. The crowd was silent as she passed, completely silent. Not the restless, shuffling silence of people waiting for something to happen, but the absolute silence of people for whom something is already happening and they are fully inside it. Some had tears on their faces. Some had the expression of people who are managing something large and have decided that managing it is the most important thing they can do right now. She tried to wave. Her arm came up a few inches and then fell back. She looked at them. She looked at face after face as the stretcher moved between the lines, face after face of people she had treated and people she had not. People she recognized and people who were strangers to her. All of them standing in the cold, flat light of this November morning because of a collective thing she had done to all of them individually over the course of 9 months. She had been in their rooms at 0200. She had held pressure on wounds while they were still figuring out what had happened to them. She had stayed behind in buildings that were becoming more dangerous by the minute. She had sat in corners of barracks and not required anything of anyone except their willingness to keep being present. She had been paying attention to each of them one at a time for 9 months. They had noticed, as the stretcher reached the midpoint of the path, something began that no one had planned or coordinated or discussed in advance. Captain Marcus Webb, walking alongside the stretcher, stopped. He came to full attention. He raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute directed at Emma. Within 3 seconds, a Corporal Reese Briggs joined him. Then Dr. Holt. Then the people in the front of the lines on both sides. Then the people behind them. The salute moved through the crowd, the way a wave moves through water, not because anyone was following an instruction, but because each person seeing the person in front of them make the gesture understood immediately that this was the correct thing and that they had already decided to do it. It was not a moment of performance. It was a moment of recognition. 500 people recognizing simultaneously the same thing about the same person. The pilot of the medical transport helicopter, standing by the aircraft with 22 years of service behind him, watched it happen from a distance. He said later that he had carried wounded soldiers out of more difficult places than he could count, and he had never seen anything like it. He said it did not feel like a military ceremony. It felt like truth. The co-pilot had a camera. She took photographs. She would not look at them for 3 days because looking at them too soon felt like it would do something to reduce them. Emma lay on the stretcher and looked up at the 500 raised hands above her as the stretcher moved between them, and she looked at all of it until her vision made it difficult to look at, and she looked at it still. She did not know in that moment who had started it. She would not find out until Germany. The first letter arrived on the 5th day at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. It was from Private Cole Rafferty, handwritten on lined notebook paper in careful block letters. He wrote that he had joined the Marine Corps because his life needed to move towards something larger than what he could see from where he was standing. He wrote that he had arrived at the base in July feeling less certain about that than he had been in June. He wrote that on his first night he had sat in the corner of the barracks with his face turned toward the wall and had been certain that everyone around him could hear him and was drawing conclusions about what kind of person cried on his first night in a place like this. He wrote that Emma Calloway had sat down beside him without asking any question that required an answer and had stayed for 2 hours and had said at the end one thing. He wrote the thing she had said. He wrote that he had thought about the difference between easier and more manageable every day since and had not been able to improve on it. He wrote that he had been the first to raise his hand because it was the only thing he could think of that was large enough for what he wanted to say. He wrote that he was sorry it had taken him so long to figure that out. The second letter came from a corporal in the engineering unit Emma had treated for a severe burn in August. The third from a lance corporal in communications who wrote about a night in September when he had found Emma in the medical bay at 0200 and she had made him coffee from the small stove she kept there for exactly this kind of situation and had listened to him for an hour without making him feel that what he was experiencing was inconvenient to anyone. By the 10th day, there were 43 letters. By the end of the third week, there were over 120. Webb had organized the effort quietly from the base, sending word through informal channels that Emma was receiving correspondence and that anyone who wanted to write was welcome to do so. He had not framed it as an order. He had framed it as information. The response told him something about the base he had suspected, but never seen in such legible form. The hospital staff, noting the volume of incoming correspondence, asked Emma if she wanted a dedicated space to manage it. They set up a small table in her room. The table filled. Emma read every letter. She read them in the order they arrived, sitting up in the German winter light that came through the window at the low, clear angle of late afternoon in that part of the world. She wrote back to every single one. Her responses were not long. She was rebuilding physical reserves, and the doctors had been specific about reasonable activity. But she wrote back to every letter with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything, each response specific to the person and the thing they had said. Not general expressions of gratitude, but actual replies that demonstrated she had read what they sent and considered it and had something particular to return. Reese Briggs called from the base on the fourth day of her hospitalization. The connection had the variable quality of all long-distance military communications, the voice arriving in segments with an uneven relationship to real time. He asked about her status in the clinical vocabulary they both used, and she gave him an accurate report in the same register. Then he was quiet for a moment, and she was quiet, and the connection did something with the silence that made it sound like weather. He said, "I should have said something sooner." She said, "You said exactly what needed to be said." He said, "That's one way to look at it." She said, "It's the only one I'm working with right now." He said her name, just her name, the way you say a name when what you mean is larger than what any sentence can carry. She said the notebook was good thinking, Reese. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He said he had not been sure she would see it that way. She said she was sure now. The connection broke and they called back and talked for another 40 minutes about his mother's cooking and the Ohio light in the fall and all the small things that act as ballast when you are a long way from where you belong. The formal review board convened at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in the second week of December. It was not a court-martial, a review of fitness documentation and service records with authority to determine appropriate case disposition, 3 senior officers and a military medical specialist. Emma attended in hospital clothes because she was still technically a medical inpatient, a fact she was aware created an unusual visual register for the proceedings, which she did not comment on. The board chair read the formal statement of findings, the falsified intake examination, the undisclosed cardiac condition, the self-managed medication protocol during deployment, the physical collapse during active duty. He read all of it in the flat administrative language that military documentation uses, which made it sound like a series of procedural events rather than 9 months of a particular life. Emma confirmed each finding as accurate. The board began its deliberation. Then Captain Marcus Webb walked in. He was not a member of the board. He had requested and been granted permission to present supplementary material relevant to the board's assessment. He carried a folder and the green notebook. He set them on the table in front of the board chair and did not sit down. He stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who has decided that the way he inhabits a space is itself a form of argument. He said he was not going to address the question of what Emma Calloway had done to get to the base in Anbar. He said the board was entirely competent to assess that. He said he was going to address the question of what she had done when she got there. He opened the folder. He read from the patient outcome records for every critical casualty response Emma had managed during her deployment. He read dates and presenting conditions and outcomes. He noted that in 9 months of the most operationally demanding period the base had experienced in 3 years, every patient Emma Calloway had treated had survived. He said that number clearly. He let it sit in the room for a moment. He picked up the green notebook. He said this was a contemporaneous record maintained by a fellow medic who had discovered Emma's condition and had chosen to document rather than report. He said the board should consider what it contained, not only as evidence of concealment, though it was that too, as a clinical record of what sustained performance under compromised conditions actually looked like when documented by someone watching it with trained eyes every day for 6 months. He said that in the entirety of that record, there was not a single entry indicating that Emma's condition had produced an error of clinical judgment. Not one by my own. He said he wanted the board to understand what that meant. It meant that Emma Calloway had managed a compromised cardiovascular system, chronic sleep deprivation, and severe nutritional deficit across 9 months of active deployment without allowing any of it to touch the quality of what she gave her patients. He said he was not asking the board to overlook what she had done to get there. He said he was asking them to weigh what she had done when she arrived. He said she came to that base to save lives. He said that is what she did. He said, I have watched a great many people serve in a great many conditions, and I want this board to understand that what I watched Corporal Calloway do is not a thing I expect to see again in my career. He picked up his folder. He thanked the board for their time. He left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. The board chair looked at the green notebook for a long time. He looked at the folder. He looked at the other members of the board. He said they would continue their deliberation. It took 40 minutes. The determination administrative reassignment with full honors retained. Emma would be medically transitioned out of combat deployment eligibility. She would undergo full cardiac evaluation and treatment with military medical support. She would be offered assignment to a non-operational training role appropriate to her expertise and service record. She would not face court-martial. She would not be discharged under adverse conditions. She would continue to serve. 2 weeks after the board's determination, the formal paperwork arrived confirming what her service record would reflect: the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. She had been recommended for following the village extraction in June. The citation described her actions in the restrained and precise language that military commendations use, because the people who write such citations understand that the facts stated plainly are sufficient. She had remained in a hostile environment under direct threat to render medical care to wounded civilians when withdrawal was the authorized course of action. She had brought every person out alive. Emma read the citation once. She folded it carefully along its creases. She put it with her grandfather's letters. The flight back to the United States was in early February. Arlo Calloway was waiting at the Columbus airport in his good coat, with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has been turning a situation over in his mind for months and has arrived at something that might be called resolution. He looked at his granddaughter coming through the arrivals door in her uniform and did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her the way he had looked at her in the photograph from Paris Island, trying to hold the exact details of the moment before the moment ended. She walked up to him and he put his arms around her, and she let him, and they stood in the Columbus airport while the world went about its business around them. In the car on the way to the farmhouse, she told him everything. Not the version she had been editing for letters home. All of it. The box in the attic. The falsified examination. The medication. The 9 months of managing the distance between what she was and what she needed to be. The notebook. The board. The outcome. She told him about the 500 raised hands and about the letter from Cole Rafferty and about the table in Germany, filling with correspondence from people she had sat with in their dark moments and had not required anything of except their willingness to keep going. Arlo drove and listened. He did not interrupt. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel and listened the way he had always listened to things, with the full and unhurried attention of a man who believed that what you were told was worth the effort of receiving properly. When she was finished, there was a long silence. He said, I owe you something. She said, no. He said, the stories I told you. They weren't mine. She looked at him. He said he had been 22 years old and stationed at Camp Lejeune managing inventory in a supply warehouse. And the men who came back from the places he had not been were different in ways he could not account for and could not stop wanting to understand. He said he had read everything he could find and listened to everything he was permitted to hear, and had built those stories out of other men's experience and other men's courage, because he had a granddaughter who needed something to grow toward, and it was the only material he had. His voice did not break, but something in it changed register. He said, I am not proud of the method. Emma watched the Ohio farmland going past the window, the winter fields pale and wide under the low sky. She said, you gave me the right idea about what mattered. You just got the details wrong. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I heard you got those right yourself. She said, yes. He reached over and put his hand briefly on her arm the way he had placed it on her shoulder in the photograph from Paris Island. Then he put it back on the wheel. They drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that is comfortable when everything that needed saying has been said, and what remains is simply the fact of being together in a familiar vehicle moving through familiar ground. At the farmhouse on the kitchen table, them three medals sat in their wooden case. They caught the last of the winter light in a way that had not changed in the 30 years as Emma had been watching them catch it. She looked at them for a while. Then she went inside. Camp Pendleton in the spring was different from Ohio in a way Emma found she appreciated. The light had a directness that Midwestern light did not, arriving without softness, without apology, illuminating the base with the matter-of-fact clarity of a place that had things to do and intended to do them. Emma's first class had 14 students. She stood at the front of the room on the first morning and looked at their faces. Young faces turned toward her with the particular attention of people who have not yet had the experiences that will later make them impatient with beginnings. She had a syllabus prepared and protocols to cover, and a sequence she had developed over 3 months of recovery in which she had thought carefully about what she wished someone had told her at the start. She had added things to the standard curriculum, sections on monitoring one's own physical condition under sustained operational stress, protocols for recognizing how capable people quietly manage their own physical decline when they are committed to a mission, ways of watching the people around you that went beyond clinical assessment into the territory of genuine attention. She had added a section she titled, What You Owe Yourself. She had written it at her grandfather's kitchen table in Ohio, in the same chair she had occupied as a child, watching the morning light move across the floor the way it always had. On the first morning of the first class, she did not deliver the syllabus immediately. She looked at the 14 faces and she said, I want to start with one thing before we get into the material. She said the bravest thing I did over there wasn't running toward the explosion. It wasn't staying in that building when my team left. It wasn't any of the things that made it into the formal record. She said the bravest thing I did was lying in a hospital bed in Germany and telling a doctor the complete truth about what I had done and why I had done it, and accepting that the outcome was going to be whatever it was going to be. She paused. She said, I'm going to teach you how to save other people's lives, and that is the most important technical work you will ever do. But the reason you need to still be alive to do it is because your life belongs to the people in this room as much as it belongs to you. You are not a resource to be consumed by a mission. You are a person who will be needed again after this mission is over by the next person who is counting on you to be there. Take that seriously. The room was quiet. She opened the first page of the syllabus. In the third row, second seat from the left, Private Cole Rafferty had his notebook open and his pen in his hand. He had requested the transfer to combat medicine training 4 weeks after Emma's evacuation from the base in Anbar. He had filled out the paperwork in the careful block letters he used for written communication and had listed his reason for requesting the transfer in the single line the form provided for that purpose. He had written, I want to do what she does. He was 19 years old. He had a great deal to learn. He had chosen the right person to learn it from, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was a specific kind of settled feeling that he had only encountered a few times in his life and had learned to recognize and not take for granted. Emma looked at him briefly from the front of the room, the same way she had looked at him on that first night at the base in Anbar, sitting beside him in the corner of the barracks while he tried to hold himself together in an unfamiliar place. She had looked at him then with the full and direct attention of someone who sees a person clearly and does not find what they see insufficient. He looked back at her now with the expression of someone who has traveled a significant distance and has arrived somewhere that turns out to be exactly as real as he had hoped it would be. She said, all right, she said, let's begin. Somewhere in Germany, in a records office at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, a green notebook sat in an evidence file that had been formally closed and administratively retained. The pages inside contained 6 months of daily observations in careful clinical shorthand, the record of one person watching another person with trained eyes and complete commitment, and the particular courage of someone who had decided that watching closely was the most important thing he could do. The last entry, written the morning of the evacuation, read, Condition critical, patient stable, outcome pending. Reese Briggs had written those 2 words and then closed the notebook and handed it to Dr. Holt, and walked beside Emma's stretcher through 2 lines of Marines with their hands raised and had not looked away from her face the entire time they walked. He had never gone back to add anything. He did not need to. The outcome was no longer pending. It had resolved itself in the way that outcomes sometimes resolve when the person at the center of them turns out to be made of something more durable than the circumstances that were testing them. In the photographs from that morning, the ones taken from the helicopter as it lifted away from the base, you can see the formation from altitude. 500 figures in the flat November light, arms raised at the same angle, held at the same height, all pointed toward the same small figure on the stretcher moving between the lines. From above, It looks geometric and deliberate, the way things look when many people make the same choice at the same moment without being instructed to. Nobody had given the order. That was the part that stayed with you. Not the scale of it, not the image, though the image was extraordinary. The part that stayed was the part you could not see in any photograph. The part that existed in the space between each of those 500 people and the woman on the stretcher. The accumulation of moments. 2 hours in the corner of a barracks, a cup of coffee at 0200, a hand finding the right position in a ruined building while the clock ran down, a voice keeping its steady quality through 22 minutes in a place that was running out of time, each moment small in itself, each one carrying the full weight of a raised hand. That was what those 500 hands actually meant. Not a tribute to a hero, a record. A record of all the times one person had looked at another person and decided that what was happening to them was worth her complete attention. Not her partial attention, not her attention when it was convenient. Her complete attention offered without reservation, regardless of the cost to herself. Emma Calloway had gone to build a real story. She had found one. It did not need a combination lock to protect it. It had 500 witnesses, and it was written in the only material that holds the memory of people who were there, who were changed by what they saw, who carried it forward into everything they did after. Cole Rafferty would carry it into the front row of a classroom at Camp Pendleton, and into every decision he made as a medic for the next 20 years, and into the faces of the patients he sat with in their dark moments, offering the same wordless presence he had once received from a small woman in a corner of a barracks who had decided that his situation was worth her complete attention. The story would continue through him. It would continue through every person Emma trained. It would continue in the way stories continue when they are real, which is to say without an ending, passing from one person to the next, changing shape, but not substance, carrying forward. The essential thing, the knowledge that the most important decision a person makes in a difficult place is not whether to be brave. It is whether to be present. Emma Calloway had answered that question 9 months ago in a farmhouse in Ohio, standing in an attic with a green metal box in her hands, looking at the medals on the shelf below. She had decided to be present. Every single thing that followed was the consequence of that one decision made once fully without reservation. And she had meant every bit of it.